Hello, everyone, and welcome to our 22nd Global Public Seminar in Comparative and International Education. My name is Maria Changseliani. I'm Associate Professor of Comparative and International Education at Oxford. These seminars are jointly organized by the Department of Education and St. Edmund Hall at the University of Oxford. Before I introduce our speaker, let me attend to a few administrative points. This webinar is being recorded and it will be posted online in due course. I will only record the first half of the webinar, the presentation itself, and will stop recording when we get to the Q&A session. Please keep yourself muted throughout the webinar unless you have been invited to speak. I would like very much to encourage everyone to ask questions and to share their comments. So if you want to do that, please put a note in the chat. So either write your question or your comment, or just indicate that you want to speak. When the talk finishes, I will invite you to unmute yourself, to introduce yourself and ask your question or share your comments. So let me introduce our today's speaker, Dr. Dante Salto. Dr. Dante Salto is Assistant Professor of Higher Education at the University of Wisconsin-Milwaukee. His research focuses on the study of higher education policy from a comparative and international perspective. He mostly looks at the issues at the intersection of quality assurance, regulation, privatization, and access. He's a faculty affiliate in the Center for Latin American and Caribbean Studies at the UWM and a research associate program for research on private higher education. His most recent research project, which is titled Crossing Borders to Connect Roots, Researching with Educational Communities in a Post-Pandemic World, is funded by the Spencer Foundation. Dante Salto holds a doctorate in Education Administration and Policy Studies from the State University of New York at Albany. In addition, he has earned his licenciatura in education from the Universidad Nacional de Córdoba in Argentina. He received the Presidential Distinguished Dissertation Award after finishing his dissertation from the State University of New York in recognition of the quality of his doctoral work. He has also received prestigious Fulbright and Organization of American States Fellowship. Both Dante and I are active members of one of the biggest professional associations in the field of CIE, which is called Comparative and International Education Society, CIES, and we co-chair the largest special interest group within CIES. It is Higher Education Special Interest Group. This is in fact how we first met, and I'm delighted to have an opportunity of hosting Dante's talk today. So Dante's talk is titled New Kids on the Block, Features, Trends, and Regulation of For-Profits in Higher Education Worldwide. Without taking more time, I will now pass on to Dante. Please, the floor is yours.
All right, thank you, Maya, for the presentation. And thank you and the Global Public Seminar in Comparative and International Education Group for this invitation. I'm happy to be here, let's say at the University of Oxford, presenting on this project that I have been working for, I guess, about 10 years, not on the worldwide aspect of it, but I started being very interested in for-profit higher education as part of my PhD studies at the State University of New York, and I was a research assistant at the program for research on private higher education PROFI, directed by Daniel Levy at SUNY as well. And I started working on the Brazilian case, the largest for-profit higher education sector worldwide. And that spurred my interest in saying, like, okay, what is outside of this? Like, what is outside of Brazil, but also what is outside the United States? Those are the most common cases. Definitely the United States, the most common case portrayed in terms of for-profit higher education. So This presentation is looking at a study that is in progress. Much of it has been done in the last year or so. And this is part of research that I'm doing in with the research assistance of a PhD student, Wanjing Liang, who has been contributing to the data collection and putting together the database on for-profit higher education worldwide that I'm going to be talking about in a few minutes. So let me tell you a bit about why New Kids on the Block. That has to do with how for-profit higher education is a relatively recent development worldwide, except for the United States, where it has been for already a while in higher education. In the rest of the world has been mostly legally established in the 80s, in the 1990s. So that's very recent in terms of historical components of higher education as another sector in private higher education. So if one were to ask people in an audience to just name a few companies and corporations, for-profit corporations that they can think of, just any type of company that is successful, probably some of these brands would actually come to our mind. They are usually, say, consumer staple corporations like Coca-Cola, Apple, McDonald's, come quickly to mind as examples of successful in their business for-profit organizations without any considerations about their quality. We recognize them worldwide. In sharp contrast, education has historically been dominated by public and private non-profit organizations worldwide. And we can think about examples as the University of Bologna in Italy as one of the first, and the University of Paris, the Sorbonne University in France, Harvard University in the US, Oxford University in the UK, just to name a few. So in that way, we have always thought about private higher education as higher education has been either private or public, and within the private sector, mostly non-profit. This is important because private institutions were established as non-profits because they would actually fulfill an educational purpose. That was the original idea of having them as the non-profit status in most of the world. What we have seen is actually an increase and the development of a relatively recent development that has to do with the addition in the private sector of for-profit higher education institutions, as well as aside of or complementing non-profit universities. These for-profit institutions range from very small, 100 to 500 students, higher education institutions, usually vocational and technical education. Sometimes they are dance schools, sometimes they are, just to give you some ideas, like hairstyling institutions, that they are higher education institutions. They are not the traditional universities that we think about, but that also happens in the nonprofit sector. So very small, family-owned, sometimes, institutions, to very large higher education institutions, sometimes universities, that are owned by multinational corporations. So when we think about for-profit corporations worldwide, they are not as widely known necessarily, definitely not by the general public as the ones that I mentioned before, but some of them, and just showing 4 of them, there are many, many more, are Apollo Education Group. Apollo Education Group, owns the largest university, for-profit university in the United States. That's the University of Phoenix. It's an online, mostly university. Konya Educação, has a large portfolio of for-profit higher education institutions in Brazil. It's one of the largest conglomerates of and corporation, publicly traded corporation in Brazil, owning a large number of for-profit higher education institutions there. Honoris United Universities. It's a group of universities owned by another corporation, Addis, and most of their institutions are based in Africa. And Laureate International is probably the largest corporation owning universities across the world, not only for profit, but also non-profits around the world. I'm going to talk a bit about that later. It has presence in Latin America as well, in Chile, used to have presence in Chile, it recently exited the market there, Peru, and Mexico. So for-profits, as many non-profits, they look a bit like this. They can be like large higher education institutions. So the one on the right, it's in Brazil. It's actually a non-university higher education institution. A university on the top, on the bottom left, it's in Peru, based in Peru. It's one of the largest universities, private universities in Peru. And then a very small 500-student for-profit higher education institution in Long Island, New York, on the top left. So you can see there that there's a mix in terms of like the size of these institutions, but also the role that they play. In general, they are actually, most of them are based on vocational and technical. They are offering vocational and technical education in their as they're part of their offerings. So how is this study structured? Well, this is an exploratory study. The main reason that it's an exploratory study is that we don't know much about for-profit higher education outside the United States. We know a little bit about Brazil. We don't know much about for-profit higher education outside of these countries. So the way that we proceeded as part of the research is like looking into publications from national experts and their portrayal of the for-profit sector in their countries, and then access to national databases that provide information on enrollment, number of institutions, etc. What are some of the main limitations that we face in this process, in this project? It has to do with data availability. For the most part, international organizations, for example, do not collect data on for-profits. They do collect information on private and public, but not on for-profits. So that's a big limitation there, and a challenge to overcome. Also, in many countries that legally allow for-profit institutions, they do not actually show the difference. They don't differentiate between for-profit and non-profit. The language is another limitation. What we have been able to search has to do with, languages that being English, Spanish, and Portuguese, the three that I am able to understand. And then definitely there's a limitation in terms of the knowledge of national cases, and that's based on actually the publications that are out there. And sometimes those publications might not be readily available in English, Spanish, or Portuguese. So let me tell you a bit about how for-profit fits within like a larger idea of like privatization and actually the growth of private higher education worldwide. And what we have seen over time is that private higher education has expanded worldwide to almost every country. It has been a switch from much of a public dominance to a private-public provision of higher education worldwide. And right now, private higher education holds a third of the total world's higher education enrollment. So this is important to keep in mind as part of the relevance, as part of what makes private sector attractive and what is actually offering. And I'm going to talk a bit about that, but it has to do with offering something different than the public sector, but also offering the possibility of expanding higher education without the need for governments to actually provide most of the funding, because most of the funding towards private higher education comes from the students and their families. So that has been one of the areas. That's why much of the enrollment on private higher education concentrates in the global south, with high shares, for example, in Latin America that reach 50%. So 50% of the students in higher education in Latin America are enrolled in the private sector. So that's a huge leap, and it has to do a lot with the expansion that happened, starting in the 1960s onwards. So one of the main things about public and private that we have witnessed is that the traditional borders, for example, in terms of finance, the private sector being primarily funded by private funds through student and families paying tuition fees, for example, and the public sector mostly funded by governments. That border, for example, among others, have blurred over time. And what we are seeing increasingly is that a privatization of the public sector through, for example, public institutions charging tuition fees, and the private sector also receiving governmental funding. So there's this blurriness in the borders that makes the process of distinguishing public and private a bit more complex. That also translates into the differentiation between for-profit and non-profit that I'm going to be talking about. That is also kind of tricky to actually differentiate between the two of them clearly at an international and comparative perspective, from an international and comparative perspective. So what do we have about for-profit? Well, I mentioned this relatively new development has been largely understudied and misunderstood globally. So we know a lot about what is the for-profit sector in the United States. We don't know much about what is the for-profit sector outside the United States. And what is interesting about for-profit, there are many things that are interesting. One of them is that different countries with very different ideological and public idea of public good in higher education actually legally allow for profit, and those are the United States, that is a market-based system, whereas France, for example, is a very public dominated higher education system. Well, both countries on kind of like both sides or both extremes, I would say Vietnam as well, they actually allow for-profit higher education. So it's quite interesting in that way. And it's interesting as well because some of the main controversies related to for-profit higher education is that this is the way that the market enters higher education in the most explicit way. So we have actually for-profit higher education institutions. The main goal necessarily is actually to generate profit as any other type of organization that is for profit, rather than necessarily just the educational goal. So there will be the proponents of for-profits actually saying, well, this is a most cost-effective type of education. It allows for more innovation because it's basically a market-based approach, and it provides that possibility of innovation that other higher education institutions, other sectors are not able, the nonprofit or the public. Whereas, the opponents or those who have been critical of the for-profit sector will mention that the profit-making values are actually in complete contradiction to the educational values and actually having education as the main mission of this organization. So there have been a lot of controversies around the for-profit sector, part of the privatization discussions. But as I will show, without much actually information about this specific sector worldwide, we are actually basing our understandings based on mostly the United States case. So as I mentioned, there are blurring borders between private and public. There are blurring borders between the for-profit and non-profit. So how do we actually go into this study in terms of defining these two and making sure that we are delimiting them and not, making sure what we are actually studying from a comparative and international perspective again. So what I adopt in this study is what we have adopted at Profi, and Daniel Levy has already worked on this in terms of what we consider public or private has to do with what is defined by the national governments or by each of the national cases. So in this case, for-profit specifically will be anything that is legally allowed for-profit as for-profit higher education institution within a national boundary, the same as government recognized for-profit higher education institutions. So we are looking at what has been legally allowed or government recognized. That is in contrast to other type of approaches to this and definitions on this that have to do, for example, and we are not actually pursuing this, although it's quite interesting to look into this probably in other type of studies. One of them has to do with private non-profit higher education institutions behaving as for-profits, and that happens a lot. It's widely known as well that, say private non-profit higher education institutions will be actually, using loopholes, etc., to actually behave as for-profits and get some of the fundings towards individuals. And then for-profit multinational corporations owning non-profit higher education institutions. So the last case, just to give you an example, Laureate International Universities, they own non-profit, legally non-profit universities in Mexico. They used to do it in Chile, for example. They are non-profit legally at the national level, but they are owned by an international corporation. It is an interesting case. I can talk a bit more about that later in the Q&A. But there are many ways of defining for-profit. For this study, we're looking specifically at those that are legally allowed for-profit higher education institutions, so from a legal standpoint. As you know, one of the main concerns when we do international and comparative education research is actually looking at ways that we can actually compare similar things, right? So we want to compare similar things with variation, of course. That's something quite interesting, but we want to make sure that we're incorporating the same institutions in this case. So there are different ways that for-profits are defined, and that varies by national context. And the three more common have to do with ownership, taxes, and behavior. These three have a set of limitations. Ownership, even if a university or higher education institution is owned by a public traded corporation, might be non-profit, legally non-profit in their own country. So that doesn't actually differentiate a non-profit versus a for-profit necessarily. The same with taxes. For-profits are supposed to pay taxes. Non-profits are, they do not pay taxes. Well, that would depend on each country. For example, in Brazil, non-profits actually pay some taxes, and for-profits pay more taxes, except if they actually offer scholarships to their students, and then they pay the same rate as non-profits. So taxation is not actually a very good proxy to actually understand the difference between for-profit and non-profit, or actually select cases. And the behavior is also difficult to actually look and trace because it's usually not, it's in the border of, the loopholes, legal loopholes in that way. The main and kind of cross-national definition and way to understand for-profits actually and non-profits and distinguish them is actually what they do with the excess revenue generated by these institutions. So for-profits can distribute that revenue to owners and shareholders, or invest them in activities outside of education. So that's the main difference with nonprofits that have to actually reinvest everything back into their own institutions or into education. So that's like a widely accepted and shared understanding of the main difference between nonprofit and for-profit across different countries. So keeping that in mind and keeping the two main components, the legally allowed, the legal framework and this specific definition in terms of use of excess revenue, I put together this map showing the countries that are in green, and this is work in progress. There might be more, and we're actually looking into this. The countries that are highlighted in green are the ones legally allowing for-profit higher education worldwide. So you will see there the presence of global north countries, specifically the US and Canada, France, Ireland. But for the most part, you will see that it's highly concentrated in the global south as well. And in the global south, these institutions have been instrumental in actually expanding the higher education in these countries, or they are being instrumental in actually that moving forward. Sorry, before I move forward with this slide, you will see that there are some countries, two countries that are actually in yellow. That means that these are countries that seem to be moving towards for-profit. In the case of China, China has recently allowed for private higher education institutions to have reasonable returns and distribute the earnings among owners. So that's a relatively recent development. So it seems to be more on the side of actually legally allowing for profit. And then the ones that are in orange actually are countries that have a presence of these international corporations that are for profit, but the countries do not allow necessarily for profit. So they actually these for-profit companies own non-profit higher education institutions in these countries. And these are countries, Mexico and Latin America, Panama, and then a few African countries, as you can see. This is giving you the names of the countries that legally allow for profit. And again, like this work in progress, but this is what we have for sure as part of the higher education institutions that allow the countries that allow for profit higher education institutions. And then the other main thing about this is like, well, all these countries allow for profit higher education institution. Well, what is the relatively size? And the size we're looking at enrollment. And we have limited data availability here. Again, there's usually countries do not actually differentiate between for-profit and non-profit in their data. But what we have so far is this is in terms of percentage of the whole of enrollment in higher education in each country, not of the private sector. So in Brazil and Peru, for example, the for-profit sector enrolls more than 35% of the students in higher education in those countries. And you can see that the Philippines and Vietnam is between 10 and 34%, and a smaller for-profit sector in Australia, Canada, Egypt, France, South Africa, United States. Some of them have recently allowed for-profits, so we don't know, so to what extent there will be an increase. This is data for 2015. And then we have a set of 8 countries in this process that we have not been able to find reliable data on for-profit higher education. But we know that in some of these countries, most of the private higher education institutions are actually for-profit. So we're still looking into this, but this actually highlights the importance of having exploratory studies that are looking at things that are actually and processes that are in development as part of the marketization, the privatization of higher education in these countries. And so what are some of the main features of these for-profits? And we're using here a typology developed by Daniel Levy that differentiates between different type of higher education, private higher education institutions based on their status. And for the most part, I'm going to just focus on what happens with for-profit worldwide. Most of the for-profit higher education institutions worldwide are non-elite. That means they are usually teaching-oriented universities, so they don't do much research. Again, most of them are not even universities. They are higher education institutions, but they are non-university higher education institutions. So think about what would be in the United States, like technical colleges. In many countries, actually, are technical colleges or other type of vocational institutes, vocational and technical institutes. And this doesn't mean that they are low quality, but they are definitely low status, as they don't actually provide, they don't actually have like full-time faculty. Usually they don't have, they don't conduct research, etc. But something important to keep in mind, and this is like a comparison with the United States and what happens worldwide, there are some similarities, but also some important differences here that we need to keep in mind, is that for-profits, as I mentioned, they tend to be non-elite institutions. They're geared towards vocational and technical degrees, short cycle programs, and they tend to attract more socially and academically disadvantaged students. Many of them, they're adult students. They are not actually out of college, out of secondary school, going into college. They're adult students. But one of the main differences that we found, and this is part of a lit review that is under review right now in a journal, is looking at one of the main differences with the United States is that outside the United States, the nonprofit and the for-profit sector are not as strikingly different as in the United States. So in the United States, in the nonprofit sector, we'll find Harvard, we'll find Yale, all the Ivy Leagues are there. Many other very prestigious universities are there. In most of the world outside the United States, the private nonprofit sector is not as prestigious. It actually fulfills a more demand-absorbing type of role in higher education. So what we mean by this is like we have to be careful in not trying to generalize about for-profit higher education from what we know about the United States. The United States can be like a good source for this. It has been the most studied, but it doesn't necessarily actually tell us much about what is happening worldwide. That's why it's important for research to continue, and this is finishing the presentation, is actually getting more. There's a need for more national, regional, and global analysis of for-profit higher education, definitely national, that can actually provide more information and more analysis about what is happening at the different in the different countries. analysis in terms of the interaction between public policies and the role and size of the for-profit higher education sector in different countries, and explore issues of access, equity, and quality. So we have like a lot of assumptions. We made a lot of assumptions about access, equity, and quality without actually having much data on for-profits worldwide. In terms of policy and practice, international organizations need to differentiate between them and collect data on non-profit and for-profit, and governments need to make for-profit data publicly available. If they legally allow this sector, they need to actually move forward with that, and that will probably increase the amount of research that is devoted to for-profit higher education worldwide. These are the references, and thank you for your attention. I'm happy to now engage in a conversation with the audience.